Well, thank you, Clive, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Clive's asked me to talk about a number of subjects today. First of all, to give you an overview of the current picture of CCS. He's asked me to do that globally, and more specifically, where we are in the United Kingdom. He's asked me to talk a bit about technology, and I'm going to keep that brief and at high level. And finally, he's asked me to give a view of the future of what a CCS industry might look like in the UK. By way of context, if you'll afford me one slide about the ETI and our activities, just to give you a perspective of where I'm coming from. The ETI is a limited liability partnership between the private sector, and you can see the large private sector companies in the slide in front of you, and the public sector, key represented by DEC and by BIS. We look across the whole of the clean energy sector, not just carbon capture and storage, and we have large projects in wind, marine, buildings, heavy-duty vehicles, etc. So I'd like to give you the idea that we look very holistically at clean energy technology and not coming from the CCS perspective alone. It's just that through all of the investigations we've done on the sources of clean energy for the country, we've come to the conclusion that carbon capture and storage and the bioelements that might feed into that are the most important technique that the UK has to reduce its CO2 emissions by 2050. Brief description of the size of the ETI's technology portfolio on the left. That amounts to some £400 million over the 10-year period that we're incorporated. And you can see it's quite diverse in its nature, and the reason for that is there's quite a lot of different types of emissions that we have to tackle. On the graph on the right-hand side, for example, you can see, starting at the top, there's emissions in the international aviation and shipping sector to tackle. There's a transport sector, principally, of course, fueled by transportation fuels. We've got to tackle emissions in the building sector, and the largest of all, the power sector. The ETI's analysis, and the analysis by the major European energy houses as well, agree in one thing, and that's the fact that it's the power sector that will have to bear the burden of the early costs of reducing CO2 emissions. And that's because once we've electrified much of the energy that we use today, domestically, transport-wise, and in industry, once we've cleaned that up, we've got a real route in for large-scale use of clean energy. Right at the bottom of the chart on the right-hand side, we've got a picture for what 2050 would look like if we develop our energy system at the minimum cost, so that we can minimize the costs of clean electricity consumers. And you can see emissions from the power sector therefore have practically disappeared by the 2050 time period. And we're left with emissions that are intractable, which are largely in the transportation sector. And that's because whilst we'd all like Teslas and BMW i3s, etc., and large numbers of vehicles that can run on electricity, they're simply too expensive for the bulk of the population today, at least. Below the graph, within, again, the ETI's analysis and with those of others, there's a contribution to negative emissions caused by the combustion of biomass material, which has collected CO2 from the air. That is combusted. Carbon capture and storage captures the CO2 and puts it underground, and therefore there's a net transportation of CO2 that's in the atmosphere to out of the atmosphere, causing what's called a negative emission. And that allows us more room and flexibility in our carbon budget to avoid expending larger sums of money tackling the problem in other ways. Just so as I don't lose anybody in the room, I thought it worthwhile just giving us a little high-level picture of what carbon capture storage looks like. The picture on the right-hand side, you can see there's a power station that'll consume fossil fuels. It might be coal, it might be biomass, as is done today in DRAX, so it could be waste, or it could be gas. But most of the stations currently in the UK take that fossil fuel and combust it in air, and they produce a fuel gas that is lean in carbon dioxide, say 4% carbon dioxide to 14% carbon dioxide. And the capture unit in carbon capture and storage extracts that CO2 from the dilute stream, pressurizes it and cools it so it gets to liquid-like properties. Once it's in that state, it's pumped out to sea. And then storage in the UK, which we plan to be offshore, is done in deep stores, very deep under the ocean floor. And often these pictures are misleading. The shallowest storage depths contemplated are around 1 kilometre, and many of the deeper stores are 4 kilometres in depth. So these stores, there's quite a lot of rock above you. Now, the security of the stores in the UK, well, we happen to be pretty good at that in the UK, because we've built up an oil and gas industry that's told us where there's a lot of very good stores with very good cap rocks and storage structures above them. And we know they're good because they've held back natural gas and oil for hundreds of thousands of years, and there's an opportunity in the UK to go and reutilise that space and sequestrate the CO2 our industry produces. So I've talked about ordinary, if you like, combustion of the fossil fuels, coal, gas and biomass. If that's combusted with air and CO2 is removed afterwards, that's called post-combustion, and you might hear more about that later in the talk this evening. There's another route that's also practiced, and we call that pre-combustion. And here we take the fossil fuels, which are basically a mixture of carbon and hydrogen. We mix them with oxygen and turn them into carbon dioxide and hydrogen. The carbon dioxide is stored and goes to sequestration, as shown on the right. But the fuel that remains is clean hydrogen, and of course hydrogen has no carbon whatsoever. So we can use that for a number, as an energy source, for a number of different applications. Burn it, use it, convert it without fear of ever emitting CO2 to the atmosphere again. And that's used in power, and that's called pre-combustion power systems. It's also used in industry. It could also be used in industry to provide clean fuel. It could also be used in the transportation sector to make hydrogen as a fuel, say for a fuel cell vehicle, or to improve the quality of existing transportation fuels. And finally, CCS can also deal with industrial emissions. So basically all of the types of emissions that you saw in the previous slide can be tackled by CCS, and that gives it a very broad application in the UK. But there's one dimension this slide doesn't show, and that's that CCS can produce these things, in particular power, on demand of the customer, and therefore at a premium value. And that makes it a perfect complement, of course, to renewables like wind and solar power, which can only produce power intermittently. When that fades, somebody has to step into the plate and provide clean power to meet peaks in demand or reductions in the intermittent renewable supply, and that's a role way out into the future for carbon capture and storage. So what's out there in the world? There's 13 large-scale CCS operations already in use. At the power station level, there's a large post-combustion project burning coal that was commissioned late last year and is now operational this year at Sask Power in Canada. And that's been a great boost to the CCS industry, because now there's actually a power station with capture facilities in operation. And we think that's a more convincing story for future finance of the industry, now that there's something fully operational with some, shall we say, runs on the board. And the other type of power station that we mentioned earlier, the pre-combustion one, is also one being commercialised at the moment at Kemper County in the United States. So very shortly we'll have both post-combustion and pre-combustion power stations in operation. In industry, a large source of CO2 is natural gas purification. Much of the natural gas that comes out of the ground contains CO2. You'll be relieved to hear National Grid insist that's removed before it's put into your houses, because it's got no calorific value at all, so you'd be like selling your water almost. So that's purified, but the CO2 that's collected from the natural gas before it goes into the distribution network is stored and sequestrated in several countries in the world. In particular, not so very many miles away from here, across that imaginary line that separates us from Norway, 2 stores have been in operation, one since 1996. So personally, as a CCS proponent, I find it quite irksome when people say the technology is new and we don't really know all of this. There's been quite a history of storage not very far from here in large stores across in the Norwegian waters. In hydrogen production, and hydrogen's principal uses is for upgrading transportation fuels. There's also 2 large demonstration units, one for clean fuels in USA and one for upgrading heavier fuels, and that's now being commissioned by Shell in Canada. And finally, even steel is underway and being constructed. There's a steel plant in Abu Dhabi in construction now, which will capture CO2 from steel. So almost all there, not yet in the United Kingdom. Now, Clive's asked me to talk about capture technologies, and we've very broadly touched on just 2 headline ones, post-combustion and pre-combustion. I won't go into all of these, because if I even took a minute on each one of them, we'll be here till 10 o'clock. I'll just say there's a vast range of different technologies. The academic community has been getting up early, intent on cleaning up the world, and there's a vast variety of different techniques available which have been tested to different levels. And certainly there's the opportunity to improve the incumbent technologies. Today, the power stations that are in use solvents mostly for the removal of the CO2 from their flue gases and then the pre-conduction. There's certainly room for improvements for these. There's no scientific reason why we can't reduce the costs of capture, either from the capital perspective or from the variable cost perspective. So everything to play for in R&D, lots of opportunities of technologies that are coming forward, but so far nothing superior to the amines has come, or the ethers has come into the market successfully for commercialization. In the meantime, there's still significant opportunities to improve what's there in amines and ethers, and I'm sure that's going to happen very swiftly as we move out from these first-of-a-kind plants elsewhere in the world. So I'd say at the moment the costs of capture, although they're significant, they're not a barrier to the initial CCS rollout, but there will be substantial opportunities to make very, very considerable improvements to CCS in the future. And technologies on the transportation side and storage side, well, the main challenge of storage is reducing risk prior to investment. The appraisal of new stores is costly, tens of millions of pounds, and taking maybe up to 7, 8, 9, 10 years to execute. That's a lot of money for many companies to have on their balance sheets, with perhaps not a certain route to commercialization at the end. So that's a problem we'll have to overcome, and are slowly overcoming with assistance from the government in terms of funding to help appraisal work. Pipelines, not so much for technology development in there. It's more about putting together a really good project that loads up pipelines with economies of scales and is structured well out into the future. Just perhaps one exception to new technologies, one that the ETI is investing in at the moment, is to do with monitoring. And this stems from the EC directives on the safe use of the seas. The directive insists that storage operators in the future who store CO2 will have to monitor the sea and satisfy the regulator and perhaps the government that the stores that they're getting paid to use are not leaking. And so there's new technologies that greatly reduce the cost and improve the efficiency of storage. So it's not all behemoth-sized technologies to make CCS. There's lots of little angles that could be exploited in the future. So what's going on? Very large in the UK. Very large organised R&D, scores of PhDs and NSDs in CCS, although we don't have a plant yet, but quite a vibrant R&D community. That's supported largely by government, and the government programme at the moment is £125 million for R&D, and that's spilled through from DEC, some funding for ETI, which largely works its way into small and medium-sized enterprises to develop new technologies. Innovate UK similarly works with small and medium enterprises to develop technology, and then pure fundamental research probably within the research councils. So that programme hasn't ceased yet, and it is still ongoing. We've got a large number of pilot plants for CCS, in particular for capture, dotted all around the countryside. I think, to me, that says there's been money put into the early bits of CCS. We've developed technologies that are competitive, and some are improvements on what might be there, but we've not moved on to full commercialisation with many of these technologies. That's going to be the next level of barriers to move these technologies towards the visibility of those that will invest in the future. And finally, our UK, the biggest thing that's happening from my perspective, and probably most in the room, is DEC's 1 billion CCS competition for commercialising a CCS project. Two projects have currently been in the final stages of it. One's the White Rose project, that's focused on Yorkshire. The picture on your right is an appraisal well being drilled for the store for that White Rose project. As I mentioned earlier, you've got to overcome quite considerable upfront costs to secure, reliably assess a store to make sure it's going to behave as it should. In this case, we needed to drill a well, so the National Grid and the ETI combined with a substantial amount of European funding to do that appraisal well. That was a very exciting project that's now being brought forward through the commercialisation project and the White Rose team. And then the second project, which is based on a very secure store from an oil and gas perspective, is the Peterhead project in Aberdeenshire. We really need both of these projects to go forward to give us a mixture of opportunities in the future. I'm going to push on to the last slide because I think I'm boring in somebody's time if I don't be quick. So summary from my perspective is CCS, we have a late start. It's been talked of, as Clive mentioned, for many years, so we can't deny the states we've started later than we'd hoped, and that the pickup is slower than we hoped. But we have to take comfort from the fact that in bits and pieces of the world it is happening. And that's without the benefit of some global climate treaty that makes it all happen by deed. That's without, shall we say, a strong incentive from the EU. Most of the projects that have started, individual nations have taken upon themselves to promote the projects on their own right. One of the best things that's happened in the UK is the advancement of legislation which paves the way for CCS. The European laws, the directives, have now been transposed into UK law, so that's all ready to go. There's carbon floor price, albeit stalled in place at the moment, and there are beginning to be contracts for difference for new projects which will fund the difference in costs between having clean power and what we have today, which is a power sector that is one of our major emissions, as we pointed out earlier. Large projects, very big risk management issues that have to be dealt with early in the project to make them palatable. But on the other hand, if you convert just one large power station, you have a huge impact on the emissions of the nation. So it's a very big impact on the overall problem we have to solve. In terms of scale, we've done a lot of study work across the community in CCS. We're sure we can put 10 gigawatts of CCS with the right incentives onto the wires by 2030. To give you some idea of size, I think the current capacity in the UK is maybe about 60, 70 gigawatts of power. Of course, by 2030, 2050, other forms of power will be on the grid, renewables, perhaps more nuclear. We don't have to do everything with the same amount of fossil fuels as we do today. That certainly may not be the case. But that residual piece of fossil fuel component we need to clean up. So 10 gigawatts is a very substantial piece of clean power to have on the wires. After 2030, we know there's more than sufficient storage in the UK to double that capacity at incremental cost to the original investment. And I think that's where I'd like to draw a line on introduction to the subject today. If you have an appetite, there's much more on CCS, both technically and financially, available on the ETI website.